The 19th century is presented to us through a specific lens. A time of invention, of progress, of steam and steel forging a new world. And alongside this narrative of triumph, there is a parallel story of hardship. A story of soot-stained cities, grinding poverty, and the children who became its most visible victims. We are given the image of the orphan, the lonely child, abandoned to the cruelties of the workhouse or the factory floor. This image, we are told, is a regrettable but natural consequence of rapid industrialization. It is a story of social failure, a byproduct of an era's growing pains. But what if this story is not just an oversimplification? What if it is a complete fabrication, designed to mask a demographic rupture so profound it defies our understanding of history? The official narrative claims that millions of children were abandoned due to poverty. In this investigation, we will not offer an alternative theory. We will simply present the evidence, the numbers, the timelines, the photographs. We will demonstrate that the official explanation is a mathematical impossibility. The sheer volume of children who suddenly appear in the historical record cannot be accounted for by the documented population of the time. This was not a trend. It was a sudden, global event. The evidence does not point to poverty. It points to a preceding catastrophe that fractured the human population, leaving a generation of children as its only visible proof. The question is not why these children were poor. The question is, where did they all come from? Our investigation begins with the visual record. The evidence that has been preserved in photographs and architectural plans. When we look, we are told we are seeing charity. We are told we are seeing the benevolent response of a society grappling with a new social problem. But the images themselves tell a different story. They do not depict makeshift shelters or humble church-run homes. Instead, we see monumental structures. Orphanages and foundling hospitals built on a scale that rivals government buildings and cathedrals. These are not buildings designed to provide temporary comfort. They are fortresses of stone and brick, with imposing facades, hundreds of identical windows, and sprawling, regimented layouts. Look at the New York Foundling Hospital, or the Girard College in Philadelphia, or the Muller's orphanages in Bristol, England. They are vast, industrial-scale facilities designed for processing, not nurturing. Why was there a sudden, international consensus to build institutions of this specific size and character? Inside these buildings, the anomaly continues. The photographs show children by the hundreds, sometimes thousands. They are not playing. They are arranged in rigid, almost military formations. Lined up in dining halls that stretch to a vanishing point. Seated at endless rows of desks. Standing in bleak, paved courtyards, staring into the camera with a detached, uniform expression. There is a strange lack of individuality. Their clothes are identical. Their haircuts are identical. The official story calls this efficiency. But it looks like something else. It looks like indoctrination. And then there are the orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929 in the United States alone, over 250,000 children were put on trains and shipped from eastern cities to the Midwest and beyond. The photographs from this era are deeply unsettling. Children, some barely old enough to walk, sit on station platforms with tags pinned to their coats, like parcels waiting for delivery. They are presented on stages in small-town opera houses for local families to inspect and choose from. The narrative is one of giving children a better life. But the visual evidence is of a mass relocation program, a logistical operation of staggering complexity. We see the system, the efficiency, the scale. What we do not see are the parents. Where are the photographs of the grieving mothers and fathers forced to give up their children? Where are the records of the families torn apart by poverty? The visual archive is strangely silent. It's as if these children appeared without any prior context, delivered directly into a pre-existing, highly organized system. The images do not show a society reacting to a crisis. They show a society managing an intake. The visual record is jarring. But it is when we examine the practical logistics that the official narrative begins to completely collapse. A system of this magnitude does not simply spring into existence. It requires planning, infrastructure, capital, and a trained workforce. The official story asks us to believe that this vast, international network of child processing centers was an improvised, charitable response to the pressures of industrialization. The timeline alone makes this claim impossible. The construction of these colossal orphanages began almost simultaneously in major Western cities in the mid-19th century. These are not wooden shacks. They are multi-story, masonry buildings that would have taken years to plan and construct. The capital required would have been immense. Who funded them, all at once? The explanation of wealthy benefactors does not account for the sheer number and coordinated timing of these projects across nations. It suggests a level of centralized planning that history does not admit. Then consider the manpower. An institution housing 2,000 children requires hundreds of staff. It needs administrators, cooks, laundresses, maintenance workers, teachers, and caregivers. Where did this professional class of institutional managers come from? The mid-19th century did not have a surplus of trained social workers and child psychologists. This was a new industry, born fully formed. It required a curriculum, a management philosophy, and a system of record-keeping. The level of administrative sophistication on display, from the very beginning, contradicts the narrative of a chaotic, organic response. The orphan trains in America present an even greater logistical problem. Think about what is required to move 250,000 children across a continent over several decades. It requires a nationwide network of agents to find the children, a central authority to process them, a contract with the burgeoning railroad companies, which themselves were new technology. It requires a sophisticated communication system, likely the telegraph, to coordinate arrivals and departures. It requires an outreach program to find families willing to take the children at the other end. This is not charity. This is a continental resettlement program, executed with a level of precision that a government would struggle to achieve even today. The contradiction is this. The problem is described as chaos, the chaotic breakdown of the family in the face of industrial change. But the solution is a model of hyper-organization. It is as if the solution was built before the problem was fully understood. How could a society, supposedly overwhelmed by poverty and social decay, simultaneously marshal the resources, expertise, and political will to build and operate such a complex, international system? The practical reality does not align with the story. The system feels engineered, not evolved. It feels like an infrastructure that was put in place to manage an expected, or perhaps already arrived, influx of human beings who needed to be sorted, classified, and redistributed. When a narrative fails the test of visual and practical logic, we must turn to the official explanations themselves. We must analyze the language used by historians and the records kept by the institutions. Here, we do not find clarity. We find a pattern of vagueness, contradiction, and missing information that is, in itself, deeply revealing. The primary cause cited for this crisis is always the Industrial Revolution. But this is not an explanation. It is a label. Historians speak of social upheaval, urban migration, and economic dislocation. These are abstract forces. They do not explain the specific demographic event of millions of parentless children appearing in a few short decades. Where are the specifics? What disease, what famine, what specific economic collapse created this outcome? The records are silent on a singular cause. Instead, they offer a generalized malaise. This vagueness is a critical failure. History is built on cause and effect. Yet here, the effect, a continental wave of orphans, is presented without a proportionate and verifiable cause. When we look at the institutional records, the problem deepens. For a system so obsessed with order and classification, the records of the children's origins are shockingly incomplete. Page after page of intake ledgers from New York, London, and Paris list a child's origin as foundling, abandoned, or parentage unknown. Sometimes an entire year's worth of entries will show the vast majority of children admitted under these categories. How is this possible? If a child was abandoned due to poverty, the parents existed. They had names. They lived somewhere. But this information is systematically absent. It is not that the records were poorly kept. The system was clearly capable of meticulous detail in other areas. It is that the crucial data point, the link to the previous generation, is missing. This forces us to question the very definition of the word orphan. The term was used as a blanket designation. Many children placed on orphan trains, for example, were not orphans at all. They had living parents who were allegedly unable to care for them. But this only deepens the mystery. What force could compel hundreds of thousands of parents, across an entire continent, to voluntarily and permanently surrender their children to an unknown fate? This was not foster care. There was often no expectation of return. The act implies a level of desperation or coercion, for which the historical record provides no adequate context. The official story fails because it cannot withstand simple questions. If poverty was the cause, why was the crisis so sudden and not gradual? If disease was the cause, where are the records of the pandemic that killed the parents but spared the children? If parents were simply overwhelmed, why do the records show a clean break, a genealogical severing? The narrative asks us to believe in an effect without a cause. It presents a conclusion without the supporting evidence. The story of industrial-era poverty is not an explanation. It is a placeholder, a simple story used to fill a profound and disturbing void in our history. If this demographic anomaly were confined to a single country or city, it could perhaps be dismissed as a local tragedy, a statistical outlier. But it was not. The most compelling piece of evidence against the official narrative is the fact that this event was global and synchronous. The same pattern unfolded across the Western world, with a consistency that defies coincidence. In the United States, you had the Orphan Trains, beginning in the 1850s. At the very same time, Great Britain was grappling with what it called its surplus population of children. This led to the British Home Children Programme, a policy under which more than 100,000 children were sent from Britain to Canada, Australia, and other Commonwealth nations. The stated reasons were identical to the American narrative: to provide the children of the poor with a better life and to provide labor for the colonies. The methods were identical: mass, organized transport and distribution. The timing was identical. Look to Australia. It was not just receiving children from Britain. It was building its own vast orphanages and industrial schools to manage its own sudden crisis of destitute children, again, beginning in the mid-19th century. The institutions in Melbourne and Sydney are architecturally and philosophically interchangeable with their counterparts in London and New York. The pattern repeats in continental Europe. France had a well-established foundling hospital system that exploded in scale during this period. German states implemented their own systems of state-run orphanages. The Russian Empire saw a similar surge. The phenomenon was everywhere. And everywhere, it shared the same distinct characteristics. First, the timing. The crisis seems to ignite everywhere in the window between roughly 1840 and 1870. Why then? Why all at once? Industrialization happened at different paces in these countries. The idea that they all hit a critical point of social collapse within the same 2 decades is statistically improbable. Second, the response. The solution is always the same: large, quasi-military, state-sponsored or privately chartered institutions focused on mass processing. This is followed by programs of relocation, either within the country or across oceans. The goal is always assimilation and the provision of labor. The children are treated as a resource to be managed and redeployed. Third, the architecture. The imposing, fortress-like style of the orphanages is a global motif. These buildings were designed to last for centuries, a strange feature for facilities meant to address a supposedly temporary social problem. This global synchronicity is the nail in the coffin of the official explanation. Local poverty does not explain a global pattern. The simultaneous appearance of millions of orphans and the simultaneous, methodical construction of a global system to manage them points away from a series of independent local crises. It points towards a single, shared, unacknowledged event that affected the entire Western world. We are not looking at the results of the Industrial Revolution. We are looking at a coordinated, worldwide resettlement program in its aftermath. Arguments about historical interpretation can be complex. But simple arithmetic is not. It is here, in the cold, hard logic of numbers, that the official narrative is proven to be not just unlikely, but impossible. Let us perform a simple analysis. We will be conservative with our estimates. Let's focus on one city, New York. In 1850, the population of New York City was approximately 515,000 people. Organizations like the Children's Aid Society claimed there were as many as 30,000 homeless children in the city in the early 1850s. Let us take a much lower number for our calculation. Let's say that in a single year, 5,000 new children entered the city's orphanages and shelters. Now, let's work backward. To produce 5,000 true orphans, you would need the death of at least 2,500 pairs of parents, or some combination thereof. Let's assume an average family size of 3 children, which is generous for the urban poor of the time. This means that to produce 5,000 new orphans in a year, roughly 1,667 families would have to be completely wiped out, or the parents would have to die. What percentage of the adult population does this represent? If we estimate the adult population of New York at around 300,000, the death of about 3,300 adults, 1,667 mothers and 1,667 fathers, would represent over 1% of the entire adult population dying in a single year, leaving behind a perfectly preserved cohort of young children. This is already a high number. But the crisis was not a single year. It was a sustained event, lasting for decades. If 5,000 children were added every year for 10 years, that would be 50,000 children. This would require a catastrophic adult mortality rate, year after year, that is not reflected in any official census or mortality data. The death rates from known cholera or typhoid epidemics were high, but they were sporadic, and they did not exclusively target adults while sparing children. They were devastating, but they do not produce the steady, industrial-scale supply of orphans that these institutions were built to handle. Now, expand this logic. The Orphan Trains moved 250,000 children from the East Coast. The British Home Children Program moved 100,000. These are just two programs. The total number of children processed by the institutional system across the West in the latter half of the 19th century is likely in the millions. To generate this number of orphans from the existing population, you would need a parent generation to have effectively vanished. You would need a death rate among young adults that would be comparable to a major war, but a war with no record, no battles, and no named enemy. The math does not work. You cannot get there from here. The pool of parents in the documented census records is simply too small to produce the number of children who entered this system. We are forced to confront one of two possibilities. Either the historical census and population data is radically incorrect, or the children did not come from that population. They came from somewhere else. The numbers tell a clear story. There is a massive demographic hole in our history. A generation of adults is missing from the equation. We have established that the visual, logistical, and statistical evidence does not support the official narrative. The explanation of industrial poverty fails to account for the speed, scale, and global synchronicity of the 19th century orphan crisis. This leaves us with a void. To fill it, we must construct a hypothesis. Not one based on fantasy or speculation, but a controlled hypothesis that adheres strictly to the evidence we have examined. This is not a claim of truth. It is an attempt to find a model that fits the facts. The hypothesis is this: the orphan crisis was not a product of the Industrial Revolution. It was the direct aftermath of a recent, large-scale cataclysmic event that has been omitted from our historical record. This event, occurring sometime in the first half of the 19th century, was uniquely destructive to the adult population, leaving behind a massive cohort of surviving children. This model resolves the major problems in the record. It explains the suddenness. A cataclysm would create an instant crisis, not a gradual trend. It explains the scale. A sufficiently widespread event could produce millions of orphans simultaneously. It explains the global pattern. An event that affected the entire Northern Hemisphere would result in the synchronous appearance of the crisis in Europe and North America. It explains the missing parental records. The parents and the society they inhabited were gone. The infrastructure for record keeping was destroyed or irrelevant. The children were, for all practical purposes, a clean slate. Under this hypothesis, the institutions we see are not charities. They are resettlement centers. Their primary function was not to care for the needy, but to take this surviving generation, a generation with little to no memory of the preceding world, and integrate them into a new, reconstructed society. This explains the industrial scale, the quasi-military discipline, and the focus on rote learning and manual labor. The goal was to create a compliant, functional workforce for a world being rebuilt from the ground up. The Orphan Trains and Home Children programs were not acts of kindness. They were a necessary redistribution of a key demographic asset. They were a way to repopulate rural areas and fill labor shortages in the colonies of a new world order. This hypothesis posits that the 19th century as we know it is not a story of organic progress, but the story of a societal reboot. The orphans were the raw material. The great leaps in technology, government, and industry were not just innovation, they were a necessity, a rapid reconstruction after a devastating collapse. The history we are taught, the gentle rise of the industrial age, is a fabricated narrative, a founding myth for our current civilization, written to obscure the traumatic event that truly gave it birth. This is an unsettling thought, but it is a conclusion that arises directly from a logical analysis of the available data. The official story does not fit the evidence. This one does. We are left with a profound discrepancy, a fracture in the timeline. On one side, we have the official history, a simple, linear story of progress marred by the social cost of industrialization. On the other, we have the evidence, the monolithic institutions, the synchronized global pattern, and the stark, impossible numbers. The story of the 19th century orphan is not a footnote to history. It may be the central, defining event of that era. An event whose true nature has been obscured by a comforting but illogical narrative. The millions of children who moved through this system were not just the unfortunate refuse of a changing world. They were the survivors of a forgotten one. The evidence for this is not locked away in a secret vault. It is in plain sight, in your local city archives. It is in the architecture of the old, imposing buildings that still stand in our cities. It is in the census records that do not add up. It is in the silent, staring faces of the children in the photographs, who seem to be asking a question we have never thought to answer. We have been taught what to think about our past. We are rarely taught how to look at it, to see the patterns for ourselves, to question the numbers, to ask why a solution of such incredible complexity and scale was created for a problem that is explained away with simple poverty. The records are not hidden. They are simply unexamined. The timeline is not sealed. It is merely taken for granted. We encourage you to look at the history of your own region. Note the dates when the great orphanages and asylums were built. Observe the patterns we have discussed here. The truth of our past is not a settled matter. It is an ongoing investigation. There are more gaps in our accepted timeline, more anomalies that hide in plain sight. If you wish to continue this examination of the evidence, join us as we seek to understand what has been forgotten.